The honourable member for Lakeland.
Well, Madam Speaker, that was a spectacle. I would suggest that if the Parliamentary Secretary to Natural Resources can't understand the connection between plastic straws and fuels for vehicles that Canadians like and want to drive, then that says all we need to know about their lack of understanding about oil and gas development, how this all actually works in Canada and the world, doesn't it? Today, make no mistake, is a dark day for Canada's democracy. Unfortunately, these dark days are increasingly frequent under the NDP-Liberal coalition government. After 8 years, I, like growing numbers of Canadians, can't help but reflect on how far away, quiet, dim, and so obviously empty were the promises of sunny days, sunlight is the best disinfectant, open by default, and collaboration with other parties, provinces, and all Canadians, no matter where they live or who they are. The truth is that after 8 years, the Information Commissioner says transparency is, quote, not a top priority for this NDP-Liberal government. She says systems for transparency have declined steadily since this Prime Minister took office in 2015, that this government is the most opaque government ever, and sounded ever-increasing alarms about the closed-by-default reality of this NDP-Liberal government in the last couple of years. But of course, back in 2017, an audit done independently by a Halifax journalist and his team for News Media Canada, which represents more than 800 print and digital titles, already pointed out that the Liberals were already failing in breaking their promises, and that the previous Conservative government was more responsive, open and transparent, including during the latter majority years, when everyone can remember the now Prime Minister made a lot of now verifiably baseless claims. Today, the NDP-Liberals want to ram through a bill that their own internal briefings warn will kill 170,000 Canadian oil and gas jobs and hurt the jobs of 2.7 million other Canadians employed in other sectors in every corner of this country, but more on that later. So Canadians deserve to know, what's transparency got to do with this? Well, let me explain. But first, also know this. The motion the NDP-Liberals have forced us all to debate today with as little time as possible is extraordinary. It's a measure usually invoked only for emergencies. And to be clear, it was done 2 times. That's right, twice, in 9 years of the former Conservative government. But it's happening almost every other day with these NDP-Liberals. So now, the background. Last May, Conservatives and so many horrified Canadians challenged the Liberals on their approach to crime, hard on victims, soft on criminals, which at the time was made obvious by the decision to send Paul Bernardo to a medium-security prison. As usual, Liberals claim to be bystanders, as they do, about almost all things happening in their government in Canada that they've been ruling over for 8 long years that day, and that the minister responsible really had nothing to do with it. Now, he was removed from that position in late July, so evidently someone over there thought he was, but I digress. To change the channel during the last weeks of that session, the Liberals dumped a number of bills in the House of Commons with promises to those it impacted that they must have never intended to keep, including Bill C-53 about recognizing Métis people that they put forward on literally the last sitting day of the session and told the people that it would be all done at once that day, a claim they had no business to make, and they knew it. But before that, on May 30th, the Liberals introduced Bill C-49, a bill to functionally end Atlantic offshore oil and to establish a framework for offshore renewable development that, get this, would triple the already endless NDP-Liberal timelines and uncertainty now for offshore renewable project assessments and approvals, and will invite court challenges around unilateral anti-development zones, the potential delegation of Indigenous consultation to the regulators as drafted, never mind the 33 references to C-69 that the Supreme Court said is largely unconstitutional for the last half a decade, nearly 2 months ago. Now, that point may end up okay in the context of offshore development, but surely we can be forgiven for refusing to just trust them this time, since both the Supreme Court and the federal court have recently ruled against the NDP-Liberal government and affirmed every single jurisdictional point Conservatives, and literally me, made about both C-69 and about their ridiculous top-down plastics as toxins decree. On May 30th, there was no debate on Bill C-49. The NDP-Liberals brought it back to the House of Commons on September 19th. They permitted 8.5 hours of debate in total over 2 partial days. What's important for Canadians to know here is that it's the government that controls every aspect of the scheduling of all bills and motions of the House of Commons, not the official opposition. They didn't bring C-49 back onto the agenda for MPs to speak on behalf of their constituents, like, for example, every single MP of every party from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador that the bill impacts exclusively. Instead, a month later, within 2 days, the NDP-Liberals brought a motion to shut down debate and sent it to committee. Now, no fewer than 7 Liberals and 2 NDP MPs argued to fast-track Bill C-49 to justify their shutdown of the debate and accuse Conservatives of holding it up. And also about all the groups and people that must be heard. This is important because of what they then proposed at committee, which was not concurrent study like the Parliamentary Secretary has claimed today. When it comes to the last-minute name change to Bill C-50, that is still the globally planned just transition, no matter what the NDP-Liberals spin to Canadians now, that the Liberals first announced plans to legislate in July 2021. They introduced Bill C-50 with no debate on June 15th, just a week before MPs headed to work in our ridings until September. They brought in Bill C-50 on September 29th. They permitted only 7.5 hours of total debate over 2 months, and about a month later, over 2 days, shut it down and sent it to committee. So Bill C-50, which represents the last step and the final solution in the anti-energy, anti-development agenda that is promoted internationally and incrementally imposed by the NDP-Liberals on Canada, which they know will damage millions of Canadian workers in energy, agriculture, construction, transportation, and manufacturing, because their internal memos show it, was rammed through the first stages in a total of 3 business days. Government bills go to committee and are prioritized over everything else. At committee, MPs analyze the details of the bills, every line, and also, most importantly, hear from Canadians about the intended and sometimes even more imperative unintended consequences and propose and debate changes to improve it before it goes back to the House of Commons for more debate and comments by MPs on behalf of the diverse people and communities we represent across this big country. That's literally Canadian democracy. But on October 30th, the Liberals brought in a detailed top-down scheduling motion for the Natural Resources Committee and changed the order of the bills to be considered, not concurrent. Their motion was to deal with Bill C-50, the just transition, first now, a reversal of the way they themselves brought in and shut down debate on each, delaying the C-49 Atlantic offshore bill they said they want to fast-track, even though they actually control every part of the agenda themselves. Their motion limited the time to hear from witnesses to only 4 meetings to go through each line and propose changes, and limited each of those meetings to 3 hours for both bills. Now, on behalf of Conservatives, I proposed an amendment that would help MPs on the Natural Resources Committee do our due diligence on Bill C-49 and send it to the next stages first, exactly as the NDP-Liberals said they wanted to do. I proposed the committee would have to deal with the problem of the half-a-decade-old Law C-69 that's unconstitutional 2 weeks earlier because so many of its sections are in C-49 and then move to Bill C-50, the just transition. Conservatives have always said both these bills are important, with disproportionate impacts in certain communities and regions, but ultimately very consequential for all Canadians. The NDP-Liberals had the temerity to say that day and since that they wanted to collaborate on the schedule, you heard it here today, and work together to pass these bills. So let's talk about what that actually looked like. It looked like a dictatorial scheduling motion to the committee, no real consideration of the proposed schedule by Conservatives, and then a preoccupation to silence Conservative MPs' participation and even suggest kicking a couple of them out, like the MP for Peace River Westlock or the MP for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, who, like me and every Conservative Alberta MP and every Conservative MP in every riding in this province, actually represent the hundreds of thousands of constituents that Bill C-50 will harm directly and who do have a right to speak and participate at any committees, like all committees and all MPs and all parties here. Believe me, we have spent every single day fighting for workers every day, and we won't stop. So for an entire month, as of yesterday, the NDP-Liberals claim to want to collaborate on the schedule for this important work. But other than a text message from the Natural Resources Parliamentary Secretary that received no response when I replied with the very same suggestions Conservatives proposed in public, and otherwise, and ironically, in the very order that they themselves rammed it all through, they really haven't dealt with us in any measure of collaboration or good faith at all. I guess now would be an awkward time to put a fine point on it and remind the ever-increasing top-down NDP-Liberal government that Canadians actually gave Conservatives more votes individually in both of the last two elections, and they are a minority government, which most people hope or claim means more compromises and more collaboration. But these NDP-Liberals do the exact opposite. And whatever happened to all those words long ago about respecting everyone, inclusion, working together, well, I guess, never mind. Which brings us to today, Friday, December 1st. Near midnight on Wednesday, Conservatives received notice of this motion today. As usual, there's a lot of parliamentese and legalese here, so I'll explain exactly what it proposes to do about Bill C-50. It will limit Bill C-50 to less than 2 hours of debate. Ridiculous. The committee will hear no witnesses and none of the affected workers, no experts, no economists, nobody, nothing. The committee won't hear from anybody. And only one day of debate will be allowed. MPs will only have 1 day to review the bill at report stage and only 1 day of debate at third reading. Given that debate at second reading was limited to less than 8 hours, this is absolutely unacceptable for the hundreds of thousands of Canadians whose livelihoods this bill will destroy. I just want to make this point really clearly. Because of the NDP-Liberals' actions so far and to date, no Canadian, hear me again, will be able to speak about the actual Bill C-50. No MP will be able to hear from any Canadian in any part of the country about it. But of course, this is just like their censorship of Canadian media. And then now they're all howling that we have to communicate directly on the only option that they've left us. This bill will impact Canada and will impact the livelihoods of millions of Canadians, as if the NDP-Liberals haven't done enough damage already, driving hundreds of billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of jobs out of this country, and they definitely don't want to hear from anyone about it. Now, it's bad enough. They did a literal last-minute copy and paste job to switch all the references from just transition to sustainable jobs, even though no one actually ever called it that before. But a National Post column in February titled, quote, "Most Canadians don't trust Liberals' plan for just transition away from oil poll." The column says, quote, 84% of Canadians do not know what the just transition plan actually is. But also, quote, 40% believe it will hurt the oil and gas sector. 36% believe it will lead to lost jobs. And, quote, 56% of Canadians are not confident the government will be able to deliver, and 26% of those people are not at all confident. It says about 1/4 of Canadians think the government is moving too fast to transition Canada's economy, what this is really all about. 60% of Canadians don't want to pay any additional taxes to support their transition. Only 14% were willing to pay only 1 or 2% more. I mean, that's bad news for the pro-quadruple carbon tax NDP-Liberal bloc coalition. 57% of Canadians worry about the impact of lost tax revenue to governments should the economy transition away from natural resources, and 40% believe the plan to transition away from fossil fuels will make Canada less competitive in the global economy. A whopping, quote, 60% of all Canadians think we shouldn't make major changes before larger global polluters make serious efforts to reduce carbon emissions. Of course, luckily, common sense Conservatives agree with all of those Canadians. For the record here, I believe all of those Canadians would be proven to be correct if Canadians let the NDP-Liberals advance the rest of this destructive agenda. But I'm hopeful more Canadians than ever see right through them now and will have a chance to stop it. It does look like it'll come down to that, since despite all the NDP-Liberals' big talk, they really aren't interested in adjusting their anti-energy agenda at all, only in escalating it at what will be more major costs and more brutal losses for the vast majority of everyday Canadians that they prove every day they don't really care about. Canadians can't stop this attack on our country by our own government, this attack on our standard of living, our quality of life, our ability to survive and to thrive here in our Canadian home. But because of the NDP propping up the Liberals, Canadians have no choice, but they'll have to deal with it in the next election. And luckily, they have a common-sense Conservative Party that is ready and able to climb our great home, our country of Canada, back up and off of this cliff. But the NDP has, of course, abandoned its traditional and often admirable position as a principled and plucky opposition party because they crow outrage every day while they themselves prop up the Liberals. Apparently, with the cooperation of the Bloc now, too, to keep them in power and to prevent Canadians from being able to have a say in an election sooner than later. The NDP-Liberals are clearly parties of power at any price now, so it's logical to conclude the truth-telling Canadians in the February column about the polls on the just transition are exactly what caused the crass and obviously last-minute name change to cover up the facts and to try to fool Canadians that Bill C-50 is not exactly what they fear and exactly what they don't trust this government to do with good cause after 8 years. It's the just transition. I'd also mention here that Alberta NDP leader Rachel Notley has also called on the NDP-Liberals to scrap this just transition plan, but they aren't listening to her either, even though their federal and provincial parties are actually formally related, unlike, for example, us, the federal Common Sense Conservatives, a federal party in its own right with no official ties with any similar free enterprise conservative provincial parties. Now, the NDP-Liberals will say this is all much ado about nothing. They'll say, as she did, that it went through committee last year. Of course, the actual bill itself absolutely did not. It was a study on the general concept, and I really must note that between April and September 64 witnesses and 23 written submissions, not a single witness, except for one lonely government witness at the very end, ever called it sustainable jobs. They all said just transition. But the NDP-Liberals together announced the Bill C-50 just transition before the committee even actually issued its report and recommendations, so that was all a bad charade too. It's ridiculous that they claim this isn't about what it plainly is. Because, of course, if there was no plan to kill hundreds of thousands of jobs and disrupt millions more, there would be no need for anything called a transition at all, right?